Now we have to testify to us Mr. Larry Ward, Director of the Michigan Conservative Energy Forum. And Larry, you're going to have multiple witnesses? Looks like.
Yes, Chairman, thank you. I'll do an introduction here while we download some technology. Thank you, Chairman Glenn, for allowing us the opportunity to testify today and speak in front of your Energy Committee. I'm Larry Ward, Executive Director for the Michigan Conservative Energy Forum. And joining me today are Ed Rivett and Jim McGinnis, two members of our Michigan Conservative Energy Forum Leadership Council. I'll introduce them as we come apart the parts that I'd like them to speak upon. We seek to introduce our organization to committee members who may be unfamiliar with our organization's goals. I'd like to share a number of data points with you today, and we have a lot of them to cover, so we'll try to get through them pretty quickly. And then to take a look at and outline some potential for things that we think in the energy policy engagement we'd like to do going forward in the future, and with the help of this committee. The Michigan Conservative Energy Forum exists to be a conservative voice for energy policy discussion, advancing innovative technologies while focusing on jobs in the economy, national security, grid security, and conservation, with a special emphasis on oversight and accountability to us, the ratepayers. We use an all-of-the-above approach to energy production while advocating for cleaner and renewable energy sources. Let me begin today, just like we started our organization, with some polling data and why this particular subject matters to your constituents. MCEF has always made a priority to release cutting-edge research, polling, analysis regarding state energy landscape. One more slide. When we first launched in 2013, we released the findings of a statewide survey that demonstrated significant support for clean energy. In 2015, the Christian Coalition of Michigan conducted its own poll, which found similar results among Republicans in the state. Just this year, we completed a combined Michigan and Ohio poll surveying 14,000 individuals, and again, the results highlighted support for transitioning to cleaner forms of energy. The Conservative Energy Network commissioned a post-election national clean energy poll just this last November that found an overwhelming support for clean energy across the political spectrum. In fact, as you can see from this slide, and you have all the rest of it in your packet that we've given you, 71% of Trump voters believe their state should embrace an all-of-the-above energy strategy, and moreover, 75% of Trump voters supported taking action to accelerate the development and use of clean energy. We have a link to these also in our presentation that you can go download all the information. These and many other state energy polls over the years have shown consistent results demonstrating what your constituents want when it comes to electricity. They increasingly want clean, reliable, affordable, and efficient energy. So along with the polling data, MCEF has conducted a number of economic impact studies. As I said earlier, jobs and economic growth are some of our key things that we focus on when it comes to energy. Your constituents just don't want clean energy for its own sake. Rather, they recognize that clean energy and energy efficiency are significant economic drivers, spurring innovation and attracting investment and jobs to our state. According to our 2014 economic impact study called Energy Optimization, continuing the policies that were in place in 2008 and going forward would have created $8.1 billion in economic output for Michigan, supported 60,000 job years, and resulted in about $2.8 billion in employment compensation. On the other hand, removing the current cap on energy optimization programs and pursuing an all-achievable, cost-effective energy efficiency would actually increase those numbers quite largely, up to $22 billion, 163,000 job years, and $7.6 billion in employment compensation. According to the Michigan Economic...
Mr. Ward, can I interrupt you right there? Because this question has always nagged me. If energy efficiency is a good thing, why do we cap it?
Good question. And we've advocated for the last few years to remove the caps.
Well, you've been around on the issue longer than I have and other members of the committee. What are the arguments presented by the utilities, assuming they support the cap? Or is that strictly a legislative function? The utilities would like to lift the cap too?
Yeah, just like this cap, the cap that's in place for other things that they've put into law. And I think you asked the Michigan Public Service Commission, Sally Talberg, about some of those caps that are in place, why they were put into place originally. I mean, obviously, legislators decided to do that. But from a utilities perspective, it was a change of business model question. How much change can they handle at once? In other words, at a 1 or 1.5% energy efficiency savings, as they make that savings, could their system actually handle a 8% or a 5% or 4% in any given year? And that changing business model, I think, was one of their original emphasis for that. We don't advocate for caps, though.
Okay, we have a good thing. I think everybody agree energy efficiency methods are a good thing, and yet we cap it.
Correct.
Okay, makes sense. Proceed.
We also did this other economic impact study that you see up on the board here. These are both downloadable on our website. The Renewable Portfolio Standard, which went from the 10%, we looked out to see what happens if you continue that Renewable Portfolio Standard going forward, out to the years, out 10 years, and it would have created $3 billion in economic output and supported about 20,000 job years. Both of these studies we are in the process of updating right now with the Hill Group that did them, so they're getting a little long in the tooth for us. They're about 2014. We should have that data by sometime this midsummer. Love to come back and share that with you as it becomes available. Not only that, we're taking into account with Hill Group the laws that were put into place. What economic impact will that have going forward? So next, I'd like to look at cost of electricity. And this particular committee has heard a lot of different numbers shared and a lot of different ways to look at the cost of different forms of electricity. What we have here in our slide presentation, in your packet, next. You might be. The Lazard numbers, one more. There we go. We at Michigan Conservative Energy Forum use an organization called Lazard. They are an asset management firm. They conduct an annual cost comparison of different energy classes, and they take into account plant and installation lifetimes, what's referred to as levelized, and they also take out the subsidies. So the question of subsidies removes from these numbers. We can go one more slide. They break this down on a chart, and this is their most recent data, just came out about 3 months ago. It's interesting to note in this particular case, we use this organization because we believe that they're an unbiased approach, and I believe the chairman's even mentioned this in the past, that these folks are under Security and Exchange rules of what they can tell their investment clients. Can't just make up things. So these numbers are really accurate. What the message they put in this particular latest release was that clean energy is cost competitive with, and some instances, cheaper than traditional fuel sources. The prices only continue to decline year after year. Consider the most recent unsubsidized levelized report shows wind, and James Cliff talked about this a little bit earlier, at 3 cents a kilowatt as of December 16th. That's at the lowest end of their scale that they have here. But I would make this case. The most reliable and unbiased estimate for what it would cost for wind energy, and that question has come up, is to ask the utility companies next time they're here, what is their latest negotiated contract for wind? And how long has it been locked in for? So set everything else aside, that is what we as consumers will end up paying. There also is some data in the Michigan Public Service Commission reports that talk about declining costs of renewables going forward. So at this time, I'm going to switch gears and talk just real briefly about the Michigan's energy policy that was done in 2016. The legislation that created PA 341 and 342, and it's going into effect next month here in April. Some of the committee, I looked probably at least maybe 6 on this committee, lived through it last year. 6 in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning voting on things, lame duck session. I will say I give a lot of credit to the chairman for the process he's unfolding as it relates to educating, giving people time to study these things. We know that it's very involved. And I will say, as it relates to that particular package, not everyone voted in support of it, and some for very good reasons, but that it did pass by a very large bipartisan yes vote. And I just wanted to go through a number of quick highlights that came out of that package. You've probably heard some of them before, and I won't go into great detail. The governor had set up very early in the process a goal of 35% combined renewable energy and energy efficiency by the year 2025. That survived in the goal. This is something that we're showing to the MPSC, target towards this, work towards it. It was where he set up as a goal rather than any mandates or anything. We do have a renewable energy portfolio that standard that was put into place, taking us from 10% up to 15% by the year 2021, with an interim step of 12.5 before 2019 to make sure that the newest forms of generation that are coming online focus on renewable energy.
Mr. Ward,
yeah.
where are we right now?
We are just over probably 10% on the renewable portfolio that exists in the state. They've all satisfied the law that was put into place that needed to be accomplished by 2015.
Now, I know we were told in the last session that we're already at 14.8. I don't remember exactly where that figure came from, but I remember that exact figure. Is that a figure that's familiar to you?
I have seen some numbers in the 11 and 12% range. You realize that with coal plants continuing to come offline, that number changes just from the pure fact that we already have existing renewable in place. I haven't seen anything up in the 14 range. I will say that talking to the utility companies and going through last session, it wasn't a stretch for utility companies to get to 15%.
All right. Okay,
so
thank
we'll
you.
get there. The other thing I did want to point out about that renewable standard that was put into place, it was on the Senate side put in place by our own Republican Senator Dale Zorn. And to his credit, he stood up in his committee and said, look, we need to show not only our state but the entire country that Michigan is serious about renewable energy and that we want to head in that direction. And a 5% isn't a far stretch. We got some reports for you that show where we line up with other Midwest states, and 15% is not a difficult challenge. Energy efficiency, we did put in some numbers. Gas, energy efficiency running out indefinitely. The electric was incented out to about 1.5%. Mr. Cliff testified earlier about they're running at a 1.3%. Some incentives put into place to get utilities to encourage their customers to use less of their product. We get that 1.5% and higher. That goes to about 2021, and then it takes over in the form of an integrated resource planning process. The Utility Consumer Participation Board, UCPB, we work to increase the scope of what they intervene in and their funding. I'm going to allow Mr. McGinnis a little bit here later to talk in detail about the UCPB and its importance and the role that it plays. We also worked in the last legislative session to get the Small Business Ombudsman on board. We work close with NFIB and the Small Business Association. That job posting for May is actually up right now, so if you're interested in representing small business in the energy world, there's a job opening for you. The retail open access, or that 10% choice market, was kept and retained in place. It did have some alternative energy suppliers assurance for capacity going forward, but it was good because at one point it was going to go to a fully regulated market. So we kept the 10% in place. Net metering and the solar end of it, which was a large contentious issue that we dealt with over the last 2 years. A lot of testimony over on both the House and Senate. You'll hear much more about it in a second from Ed Rivett. And then I just want to point out the one thing that was missing from that package last year. It was referred to a little bit earlier. There was something in place that was called the 50-50 split. It was that all new energy production in the renewable category had to be competitively or put out there for bid so that half of it came from non-utility companies. It was done away with, and we have some work that we have to do coming back around for that one. So we've been really proud of our accomplishments and the work, and looking forward to working with this committee, even better advancing energy policy. I'd like to at this time introduce Ed Rivett, one of Michigan's most well-known and respected conservative political activists. Some of you know him by his day job with the Right to Life. As a disclaimer, the Right to Life is not engaged in energy policy issue. Ed is here on his own behalf. He is also a member of our Leadership Council, and I brought him here today to share the story of solar.
Thank you, Larry, and Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. So now when we talk about net metering, it's kind of intermixed with the phrase distributed generation as a result of the legislation. So I am a distributed generator, because there I am. in front of the solar panels on my property. 14 years ago, I built a home south of Lansing near Mason on 10 acres of property. At that time, I chose to put in a geothermal heating and cooling system with a closed-loop system because it made sense, especially for the long term of my investment in this home, raising my family and so forth. I also wanted to take advantage of biomass because I have a lot of trees on my property, so I have a wood stove, and we burn about 12 face cord of wood all year long as our primary heat, and the geothermal is my backup. But the reality was that solar was not a practical investment back then. But things have changed very dramatically in the last 5 years. It's a game-changing kind of thing. And so February 1st, I turned on my solar array, 36 panels because I have the space, and I am a net metering customer with Consumers Energy. So obviously, and I've yet to find that small-scale wind residential isn't there yet. So, but I might get a fourth form of renewable energy before I'm done. So, obviously, I'd like to focus my comments then on with regard to where Michigan is situated now with net metering, solar, distributed generation, et cetera. My assessment of last year's legislation, which we were very involved in, it resulted in a short-term do-no-harm kind of strategy or status. So current net metering participants and those joining the system through June of next year will be able to continue with their current arrangements at least through 2020, so sort of a 3-year kind of grandfathering clause, because the law we passed last year requires the MPSC to conduct a cost-benefit study and provide recommendations as to the need for an appropriate tariff for distributed generation customers. And that report is those recommendations are due by June 2018. Thereafter, the utilities would be expected to file rate cases based on those recommendations. So everything was kind of going to be based on what comes out of the study, and should there be a tariff, should there be a cost, a grid-related cost, et cetera, for persons like myself who want to put surplus energy on the grid. That process actually begins tomorrow afternoon at the MPSC offices, and the Conservative Energy Forum will be represented at those meetings. As we were part of Chairman Knopf's work groups during his 2-year process that he engaged with the energy package last session. So we, as the Conservative Energy Forum, remain committed to being a fact-based advocacy group for policies that advance our strategy of all of the above, homegrown, Michigan-based, job-producing, diversified energy production. That's a bit of a mouthful, but in all of those categories, solar fits very nicely, and I'm convinced that the numbers of this cost-benefit analysis that the MPSC is going to engage will show that distributed solar generation will be a win-win times 2 or 3. When we think about the jobs, when we think about the impact on the environment, when we think about stabilizing the grid or adding capacity, especially around the peak time, et cetera, there are a lot of wins that can come about by expanding people putting solar energy onto the grid. So as you know, the current law requires regulated utilities to allow only 0.5% of all generation to be from residential net metering customers, and 1% overall when we also include commercial or industrial solar distributed generators. So the Conservative Energy Forum continues to advocate for these caps to be removed. If Michigan residents and even small business investments want to be made in clean and renewable energy, and they bear the investment costs, not the utilities, not the ratepayers, then by all means they should be allowed to put their excess power on the grid. And there are a number of reasons this represents good public policy, and not the least of which is the cost effectiveness of including solar generation capacity. Solar installations are most productive right when energy demand and the cost of peak demand production is the highest, as we heard a lot about earlier. When you look at levelized costs, expanding solar to its fullest advantage maximizes efficiencies and is good business. And utilities have clearly seen this value too. Last summer, I toured the Indiana-Michigan Power Company's solar installation in Mishawaka, Indiana, just across the border. This is just a 2.6 megawatt array with 29,000 panels, but it was making the most valuable electricity its customers demand with zero fuel cost, very limited staff expense on site, and a very modest overall footprint in land. It just didn't take up a lot of space to produce energy with no fuel cost and no environmental cost as well, at least in terms of fuel use. So in the simplest terms, we are at the place where the bang for the buck has arrived with solar energy, and it will only get better in the future. One last point I want to make about solar has to do with how in various applications, and certainly residential, how it will be classified with regard to property taxes. A solar array is a resident's investment in their overall private property, no different than putting in an automatic backup generator system or any other energy production like a furnace or what have you. It is generally considered an additional fixed structure for the homeowner's property insurance. I called ahead and said, hey, if something happens to my solar panels, will they be covered under my homeowner's insurance? I said, is it fixed? Do you move it around? I said, no. And they said, then it's an additional structure and it's covered under your insurance with a standard deductible if it's damaged. So it should not be taxed with any special or additional assessment beyond the value that it adds to the property owner's homestead. Certainly when I go to sell my house, I expect to sell it for more because of that thing, and so my house will be more valuable. It should, it should have a higher tax rate. And I'd like just to add one final comment about energy efficiency. Before a cliche becomes something worn out and tired that we tend to disregard, it was conventional wisdom. And before it was conventional wisdom, it was just wisdom. And so the cliche, waste not, want not, or a penny saved is a penny earned, really are wisdom. That's what I was raised with. I can go into a big, long story about how my grandmother, raised in the Depression, used to save all the wrapping paper at Christmas and birthdays. So energy efficiency should never have a cap. We shouldn't want to waste anything. Now, because I have solar panels in my backyard, when the sun is shining, I look up and I say, hey, I'm not wasting that sunshine. It's producing energy for my family and for my neighbor down the road if I don't use it all. So there's just a lot of good policy that this committee can put forward that makes sense, that's good on so many fronts, from job production to helping our environment and improving health. It's just the right thing to do, and this committee has the opportunity going forward to do many of those things.
Mr. Rivett, thank you for your testimony. Tell me about the folks up in the UP and the caps on the net metering program.
Well, I guess in my conversation with Representative Diana, they've already kind of hit that peak, and
so
there's just no base. I have my master's degree in policy analysis and evaluation, so I do cost-benefit study. That's what I was trained to do. And there is no basis for saying we should stop people from being able to, especially in an area so challenged with distribution issues and generation issues. Make all the juice you can up there. The sun is shining, and I'm going to bring this in. God gave it to us. We should use it.
So who benefits from these caps?
No one that I can think of, unless...
Mr. Chair, thank you. Representative Lauer. Excuse me, Mr. Ward, you look like you had an answer.
I was just going to say the utilities benefit because they're producing the power you don't produce yourself. So
Yeah,
the cap was put into place. We brought it up earlier, but it's a cap in place by the utility companies.
It's kind of like they say lawyers shouldn't ask questions if they don't know the answer, and I kind of thought that might be the answer. Representative Lauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Just a couple questions for you. I noticed you said you burn wood even though you have the geothermal system. I was curious to know why.
Because it's there. God gave it to me. The lot of dead ash trees were already there, and I said, I'm not going to waste it. And it's warm and cozy, and my kids love it because we homeschool them, and they sit around that fire and do their math.
So it doesn't have anything to do with cost.
Well, it's just practical. The geothermal is extraordinarily efficient for air conditioning in the summer, which was another motivation for me to use it. And the land is there, so I use it.
Okay. The other question would be, hypothetically, if your neighbor could have gone in on the solar array with you and then had it hooked directly to his house to share it, would that have been something you were interested in if you could legally do that?
Actually, my neighbor next to me now, he's thinking about putting solar on his property. He wants to know if he can sell it to the rest of the neighbors. So I've already had that conversation with the neighbor.
Okay.
I built the capacity for what my family needs are, and just the net metering is an opportunity. If we're not home and the sun is shining, we're on vacation for a week in July, then that energy would be available for the neighbors and the grid, and I benefit by reducing my bill.
Thank you.
Representative LaFave?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you guys very much for coming in today. My question, and you might not be able to answer it, but is it cheaper to have, theoretically, and I'm not advocating this, but for every home in Michigan to have a solar panel, or would it be cheaper for large-scale industrial solar facilities? Do you kind of get where I'm going with that?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly, large scale is more efficient, so we want to encourage that where we can, and I think the utilities continue to expand that. They see the value in it as well, especially as we look at what is it going to cost to put that next level of peak capacity in place, and what's the cheapest way to put it in place so we can keep that spike down. And so they'll obviously crunch the numbers and do that. Solar in a residential setting has a lot of factors that play into it. Some people like their house all surrounded by trees. You know, trees and sun don't go together well. So it's not going to be an application that fits for every single person, but I do believe that as technologies improve, I mean, we are all waiting with bated breath to see how Elon Musk's solar shingles play out, so that anybody who has a roof that gets some level of solar exposure, it might be very, very practical in the future that everybody just puts that kind of shingle on their house. I can see that in 10 years. But again, it's not a practical application for everyone now, because you at least have to have some good southern exposure to get the solar capacity.
Larry, the third gentleman on your panel, what's your name, sir?
Jim McGinnis.
Mr. McGinnis,
Yeah, I can introduce him real quick and go to
well,
my
what I'm going to ask, because we got questions stacked up just for Ed, I would ask, because I think it's freestanding in its own right, you represent an organization that intervenes in rate cases on behalf of ratepayers, and we give you tax dollars to do it, right? Would you be willing to come back at a separate hearing and take however much time it takes just to tell us about your function?
Sure, I wouldn't, but actually our board is funded through ratepayer contributions. Basically, it's about a cent or two a month that all of us as ratepayers pay into a fund, and that's what we use to fund interveners in rate cases.
Okay, I misspoke.
It's not tax dollars.
I misspoke. I said tax dollars, and in fact, it's ratepayer dollars. But can you come back for another hearing?
I can.
And do you live in the Lansing area?
I live near Traverse City.
Well, my apology. Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. Ed, I wanted to ask you about the property tax assessment on the solar panel that you have. I didn't catch everything that you said, so I apologize for that. Were you suggesting that there's, and I've heard of cases of this where assessors will go in and essentially mark up the value of a property tax, which of course diminishes the affordability of the asset at that point and the marketability of it. Is that what you're talking about, is it being taxed differently?
Well, I think there's some question about it because it's considered an asset, or because it's a generation asset. There are some
Right.
people who want to discuss the fact that it should be taxed similar to the way other business opportunities. So it wouldn't just be considered an asset as a part of a private residence. It might be some sort of a business thing. So they could apply a business tax to it or something. I'm trying to think of the case we were just discussing the other day where
I've heard of
a
some
local
about this,
assessment
yeah.
considered it, a local assessor considered it part of a guy's small business, but it didn't reach above a certain threshold, so he wasn't going to have to pay the additional tax on it anyway. So it's just not clear what its status is considered, I think, in law.
Okay.
Right, we are looking for it to become classified as personal property, just like other personal
Okay.
property, not be assessed as an improvement to your home.
Sure.
And there have been a couple number of cases right now that have gone both ways. Ann Arbor's fighting one, Traverse City Commercial.
I heard Ann Arbor was, ironically enough.
Yeah, Ann Arbor of all places.
And then to your point about, technology with, solar shingles and everything, I like to make the point that literally 10 years ago, the first iPhone came out, and now they have completely saturated the market with countless competitors and everything else, and smartphones, all of that, multimedia and data service, and I think we're on the cusp of another emerging technological revolution on the energy side. And you just think about how our lives have changed in the last decade with the mobile devices we have now. I think the same could come with energy in the future. So thank you. And
Vice
thank
Chair
you, Mr. Chair.
Lisinski, you'll have the last question, and if we can get the question and the answer in about 2 minutes at most, that would be appreciated.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is going back and looking at the unsubsidized levelized cost of energy comparison. So would your position be that all things being equal, if two energy producing technologies were of the same cost, that the ones that you have kind of above your line, the alternative energy, would be preferable?
Obviously, we're here on behalf of ratepayers, and it's one of our key focuses. So yes, the less or least affordable form of energy production, albeit we do
Well, I
advocate.
guess I'm saying if the costs are equal, so if I look here, we have, solar in the range of 49 to 61 and gas combined in the range of 48 to 78. If we were to say kind of their midpoints, they were, all things being considered equal, they were essentially the same cost. Would your groups, based on your polling and your survey data, say that you would have a preference for the generation of energy by alternative sources versus conventional?
Yeah, the cleaner,
costs being
more
equal?
renewable form of energy would be the choice, albeit I will point out that we are advocates of a diversified portfolio mix. Doesn't mean you go 100% with
Right, but I'm just saying,
anything.
if we're if we have this and one more is being added,
Yes.
costs being equal, your group's position would be that you would prefer it to be from an alternative energy
Correct.
source.
Yes.
Very quickly, one of the reasons why is with renewable, particularly with solar and the like, and wind, you don't have fuel costs. So that part becomes very stabilized. It's just the capacity is there to generate the electricity without the fluctuation in fuel costs. So that's why it becomes a long-term.
Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. Sir, we need to have you back where you're first up and have as much time as you need. And it's any Tuesday between now and December of 2018. So we can accommodate your schedule. I need a motion to excuse Representative Garrett. Vice Chair Lisinski makes a motion without objection, so ordered. House Energy Policy Committee stands adjourned.